He asked the marriage agency for a woman nobody wanted. Not young, not beautiful, not charming. He wanted someone the world had already passed over. A woman with gray hair, rough hands, and no illusions left about what life owed her. The agency thought he had lost his mind. But Caleb Mercer had his reasons. Bitter, stubborn, iron-hard reasons that lived in the part of his chest he never talked about. What he did not expect, what no one expected, was that the woman who stepped off that train would be the most formidable person he had ever met in his life. This is the story of a rancher who thought he was choosing the safest possible bride, and the 56-year-old widow who turned his entire world upside down. If this is your first time here, welcome to our channel. Stay with us until the very end. This one is worth it. If these stories move you, please hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The letter Caleb Mercer sent to the Frontier Marriage Registry in Topeka was 3 paragraphs long, written in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who rarely put words on paper and chose each one like he was spending money he didn't have. The woman who read it, a Mrs. Dorothea Fitch, who had been matching frontier settlers with prospective brides for 11 years, read it twice. Then she set it flat on her desk, pressed both palms against the wood, and stared at it the way you stare at something you're not entirely sure is real. In 11 years, she had received requests for women with particular hair colors. She had received requests for women who were good cooks or good seamstresses or came from particular states. She had received requests, more than she liked to admit, that specified height, figure, and youth with an explicitness that made her jaw tighten. She had never received a request like this one. "I'm not looking for a young woman," Caleb had written. "I am not looking for a woman who is considered pretty by the usual measure of things. I would prefer a woman who is older, past 40 at the very least. Widowed is fine. Children grown and gone is fine. I want someone who has already lived through the hard parts and knows what survival looks like. Someone who won't arrive on my land expecting roses and find herself broken when she gets mud instead. I have 50 acres outside of Hays, Kansas. It is not comfortable. The winters are mean. I am not an easy man to live alongside. But I work hard, I am honest, and I do not drink. If your agency can find me a woman who understands what I am actually offering, I would be grateful." Mrs. Fitch read the postscript twice. "I am 38 years old. I know this will seem strange. I am not interested in beauty. I am interested in someone the world has already overlooked, because in my experience, those are the people who turn out to be worth the most." She sat back in her chair. In 11 years, she had never placed a man who actively requested an older woman. She wasn't sure she had ever placed a woman past 50. The registry's files were full of younger women. Women in their 20s and 30s who had come west looking for fresh starts. Women who were still considered, in the currency of the frontier marriage market, as having value. The women past a certain age were another matter. They existed in the back of the files, the ones the registry didn't advertise. Widows who had written in with quiet, practical letters, not asking for much, not expecting much, simply hoping someone out there might need what they still had to offer. Mrs. Fitch kept their letters because throwing them away felt cruel. She'd never quite known what to do with them. She opened the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. She found Margaret Holloway's letter 4 folders back. Brett. Margaret had written to the registry 14 months earlier, and she had written the way she did everything, without decoration. "My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 56 years old. I was married for 31 years to a man named Robert Holloway, who died of fever 3 winters ago. We had 3 children. All 3 are grown and settled with families of their own in Missouri. I have managed the family farm alone since Robert passed, but the land belongs to my eldest son now that he is married, and I find myself without a place that is genuinely mine. I am not asking for romance. I understand that a woman my age does not inspire that kind of letter. I am asking for honest work, honest company, and a place to be useful. I know how to manage livestock, preserve food, read weather, and stretch a dollar until it screams. My health is good. I am not fragile, though I am not young either. I have gray hair and hands that show the years. I am telling you this plainly so no one is surprised. If you have a man somewhere who needs a practical partner and not a pretty picture, I would like to hear from him." Mrs. Fitch set the two letters side by side on her desk. She had been doing this job for 11 years. She had never had a match feel quite so obvious. The letter that arrived at Margaret Holloway's rented room in Springfield, Missouri, came on a Tuesday in early October, and Margaret read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read it the same way she read everything, carefully, without rushing, looking for what the words were actually saying rather than what they appeared to say. A rancher in Hays, Kansas, 38 years old, 50 acres. He had specifically requested an older woman. He had specifically requested someone plain. Margaret set the letter down and looked out the window at the bare October trees. Her daughter-in-law, Clara, appeared in the doorway with flour on her apron and the kind of expression that meant she'd already read something on Margaret's face she wasn't sure she liked. "What is it?" "A letter from a marriage registry," Margaret said. Clara came to the table. She was a decent woman, Clara. Margaret had always thought so, even on the days when the house felt too small for both of them, even on the days when she caught Clara glancing at the door to Margaret's room with an expression she tried to hide. It wasn't cruelty, it was just arithmetic. A house had space for a certain number of people, and 3 children under the age of 6 changed the calculation. "A marriage registry," Clara repeated carefully. "There's a man in Kansas," Margaret said. "Rancher, 50 acres. He wrote to the agency asking for a woman past 40. Widowed. Experienced." She paused. "He said he wanted someone the world had already overlooked." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's an odd thing to write." "It's an honest thing to write," Margaret said. She picked up the letter again. "Read the last paragraph one more time." The registry had included a brief description. Caleb Mercer is described by those who know him as hardworking and solitary. He has farmed the same land for 9 years. His neighbors confirm he is reliable. He does not have a reputation for cruelty or drink. He is not a man given to easy conversation, but he is considered fair. Not given to easy conversation. Margaret almost smiled at that. Robert had never stopped talking from the morning they met until the morning his fever took him, and she had spent 31 years both loving and being exhausted by that endless river of words. The idea of a man who wasn't given to easy conversation did not frighten her. She looked at Clara. "I think I'm going to write back," she said. Clara's expression shifted into something complicated. Relief and guilt arriving at the same moment, tangled together in a way neither woman acknowledged. "Are you sure?" Clara asked. "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I'm going to write back anyway." The correspondence between Caleb Mercer and Margaret Holloway lasted 6 weeks. His letters were short, blunt, practical in the way that frontiermen were practical, measuring every word like it cost something. He wrote about the ranch, the lay of the land, the condition of the soil, the cattle he ran, the problem he'd had the previous spring with a section of fencing that kept failing. He did not write flowery things. He did not write about feelings. He wrote about what her life would actually look like if she came, and he seemed determined that she understand the full weight of it before she agreed to anything. "The house has 2 rooms and a loft," he wrote in his 3rd letter. "It is not large. The kitchen is functional but not comfortable. The nearest town is 8 miles. The winters here are not like Missouri winters. They are worse. I want you to understand that before you decide." Margaret wrote back about Missouri winters that had cracked the walls of their farmhouse and frozen the pump handle solid. She wrote about the year the cattle sickness came through, and she and Robert had lost 11 head in 3 weeks. She wrote about managing the farm alone after Robert died, doing the work of 2 people in a body that was still grieving. "I am not afraid of hard winters," she wrote. "I'm afraid of being useless. Those are different things." Caleb's 4th letter arrived faster than the others. It was only 2 sentences longer than the rest, but Margaret read those 2 extra sentences 4 times. "I did not expect that answer. I think I have been looking for someone like you for a long time without knowing that's what I was doing." She folded that letter and put it in the small cedar box where she kept the things that mattered. Tom. She arrived in Hays, Kansas on a Thursday in the first week of December with 1 heavy trunk, a smaller bag over her shoulder, and the particular kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having been afraid so many times that it no longer stops you from moving. The train platform was cold, a sharp cutting cold that was different from Missouri cold, drier somehow, and meaner, with a wind that didn't so much blow as push. Margaret stepped down from the train car and stood on the platform and let her eyes adjust. She did what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. She looked at everything. The station building, small, weather-beaten, functional. The stock pens at the far end of the platform holding 6 or 7 horses. The wagons lined up along the road beyond the fence. The quality of the wood on the platform boards, which told her something about how long this town had been here and how much money it had. The way the other passengers moved, hurried, heads down against the wind, which told her something about what kind of place this was. And then she saw the man standing at the edge of the platform. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their hands rather than with weights, with the kind of face that had spent years in weather and showed it. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something unpleasant for so long it had forgotten how to unset. He was wearing a good coat, not a fancy coat, but a good one, carefully maintained, which told her he took care of what he had. His boots were practical and worn, and visibly, if you looked at the left one, in need of resoling. He was scanning the train doors with an expression that was trying very hard not to look anxious and not quite succeeding. Margaret watched him for a moment before he spotted her. Then she picked up her trunk because she was not a woman who waited for someone else to carry her things when she was capable of carrying them herself, and walked toward him. He saw her coming, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not disappointment, exactly, but something recalibrating. Like a man who had told himself he knew what to expect and was discovering that the actual thing was different from the picture in his head. She stopped in front of him, set the trunk down. "Your horse," she said, nodding toward the stock pen, "is favoring its left leg. Has been standing that way since I stepped off the train." She glanced at his wagon, visible beyond the fence. "And your left rear wheel has enough wobble in it that I wouldn't want to be sitting in that wagon on an 8-mile road without checking the axle pin first." Caleb Mercer stared at her. Whatever he had been preparing to say, a greeting, an introduction, something, seemed to have gotten lost somewhere between his intentions and his mouth. "I'm Margaret Holloway," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. "I'd shake your hand, but mine are cold from the ride, and I don't think either of us wants to bother with the formality just yet." He was quiet for another moment. Then something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a smile, more like a muscle remembering it knew how to move in that direction. "Caleb Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "Careful." "You're right about the wheel. The horse I'm not sure about. Left front. Watch him when he moves out of the pen." "You could tell that from here?" "I've been looking at horses for 40 years, she said. "You learn things." He picked up her trunk without asking, which she let him do because the trunk was genuinely heavy and she wasn't so committed to her own independence that she'd refuse help out of stubbornness. They walked toward the wagon in silence, and she watched him check the axle pin before they climbed up. Not making a show of it, not looking at her while he did it, just doing it the way a man does something when he's decided it's sensible. She noted that. They were almost out of town, the last buildings falling away behind them into the wide open gray of the Kansas winter, before either of them spoke. "The house," he said. "I want you to know it's not—" "You told me in your letters," Margaret said. "Functional, not comfortable. 2 rooms and a loft, I remember. I just didn't want you to be surprised." "Mr. Mercer," she said, and she kept her voice even. "I'm 56 years old. I've been surprised by blizzards, crop failures, sick cattle, a husband who died faster than anyone expected, and a government that keeps promising things it doesn't deliver. I don't imagine your house is going to be the thing that finally does me in." He was quiet for a long moment. The horse, the sound one, not the favoring one, he'd left the lame one at the livery without her having to say another word about it, moved at a steady pace. The wind pushed at them sideways. The land stretched out in every direction the color of old bone. "You're not what I expected," Caleb said. "No," Margaret agreed. "I suspect I'm not." She looked out at the Kansas plain spreading flat and enormous to every horizon, the winter sky pressing down on it like a lid, and felt the thing she always felt in new places, that particular mixture of uncertainty and readiness that she had stopped trying to separate, because they'd been traveling together inside her chest for so long that they'd become the same feeling. She didn't know yet what this land would ask of her, but she had never yet met a piece of land that asked more than she could give. The wagon moved on through the cold, carrying two strangers toward a house neither of them was entirely sure about, for reasons neither of them had finished explaining to the other. That was all right. They had time, or at least, she was willing to find out if they did. The ranch appeared at the end of a rutted track that wound between two low rises in the land, and Margaret saw it from a quarter-mile out. A cluster of buildings huddled against the winter sky like something bracing for a blow it knew was coming. She had expected modest. Caleb had been clear about that. But there was modest. And then there was this, a main house built of rough-cut lumber that had weathered to the color of driftwood, a barn to the left that was larger than the house and in marginally better repair, a chicken coop with a leaning wall, and a storage shed with a roof that had developed opinions of its own about which direction it wanted to face. Margaret said nothing. She looked at all of it the same way she'd looked at the train platform, steadily, cataloging, not flinching. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down first. He tied the horse to the post and then stood there for a moment with his hand on the animal's neck, not looking at her, which told her he was waiting to see her reaction and trying not to look like he was waiting. "The barn roof looks sound," she said, climbing down on her own side before he could come around to help. "The shed is another matter." He looked at the shed. "It's been like that for 2 years. How long have you been meaning to fix it?" "A beat." 2 years. She picked up her smaller bag from the wagon bed and walked toward the front door of the house. "Is it locked?" "No." She went inside. The main room served as kitchen, sitting room, and dining room simultaneously, which was common enough on the frontier that it didn't trouble her. A cast-iron stove sat against the interior wall, cold now, with a woodpile beside it that was lower than it should have been in December. A table with 2 mismatched chairs. A window facing south with a crack in the lower corner that someone had sealed with what looked like paper packing and a prayer. Shelves along one wall holding supplies that were organized in the manner of a man who lived alone and had developed his own system, which meant they were organized in a way that made sense to exactly one person on Earth. She turned around slowly. Caleb was standing in the doorway. "The window needs proper sealing before the deep cold sets in," she said. "What's that patch made of?" "Paper and some linseed oil. That'll hold until about January, and then you'll be heating the outdoors." She set her bag on the table. "Do you have glazing putty?" "In the shed." "Of course it's in the shed." She looked at the stove. "Has this been swept recently?" "Last spring. It needs to be swept again before you light it. You don't want a chimney fire on top of everything else." She moved to the shelves, scanning them with the efficient eye of a woman who'd managed a household's food stores for 3 decades. "Your cornmeal is in the wrong container. Tin, not wood. Mice will get into that wood box before winter's out." She touched one of the jars. "This apple preserves. When were these put up?" Caleb crossed his arms. "Not defensive exactly, but close. My neighbor, Mrs. Halsey, brought those in September." "They're fine then." Margaret stepped back and looked at the room as a whole, not with disapproval, just with the clear eyes of someone making an accurate assessment. "It's livable," she said finally. "It needs work, but it's livable. I told you it wasn't comfortable." "You did." She turned to look at him. He was still in the doorway, still with his arms crossed, wearing an expression she was starting to recognize, a kind of stiff readiness, like a man waiting to be criticized and determined not to show that he cared about it. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not here to make you feel bad about your house. I'm here because it needs things done and I know how to do them. That's what I wrote to you about. That's what we agreed on." Something in his jaw loosened, just slightly. "The loft is through there," he said, nodding toward the ladder in the corner. I thought you'd want your own space until we've had time to—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider his phrasing. "Until we've sorted things out." "That's sensible," Margaret said. She appreciated that he'd thought about it. She picked up her bag and walked to the ladder. "Supper. he said. I've got salt pork and some beans on. Wasn't sure when the train would. I'll sort supper, she said, not unkindly. You go check on that horse. She sorted supper. It was not a complicated meal, but she improved it in 4 small ways without making a production of it. Added the dried herbs she carried in a tin in her bag, adjusted the ratio of water to beans, found a heel of cornbread in the back of the shelf that was still good enough to eat warm if you wrapped it near the stove, and set the table with the 2 mismatched chairs pulled to reasonable positions rather than the slightly awkward angles they'd been left in, which suggested that Caleb almost always ate standing at the shelf and rarely used the table for its intended purpose. He came back from the barn smelling of horse and cold air, stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, and looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. "Smells different," he said. "I added thyme, and I found your pepper, which was behind the tin of nails, which is its own problem we can discuss another time." He sat down. She put the bowls on the table and sat across from him, and they ate in the quiet way of 2 people who are both comfortable with silence, but haven't yet established the particular quality of silence they share. After a few minutes, Caleb said, "The horse has some heat in the fetlock. Not bad, but I'm going to wrap it tonight." "Probably been like that a few days," Margaret said. "Did he seem stiff leaving the barn this morning?" Caleb looked at her. "How would you know that's how long—" "Because the skin isn't broken and the swelling is minor, which means it's past the worst but hasn't fully settled. If it were fresh today, you'd see more heat. If it were a week old, you'd probably have noticed on your own." He was quiet for a moment, working through this. "He did seem stiff yesterday," he said. "There you go." She broke off a piece of cornbread. "What's his name?" "Roman. He needs 3 days easy. After that, he'll be fine." She looked up from her bowl. "You have enough horses to manage without him?" "I have 3 others. It'll be tight, but manageable." "All right." She ate for a moment. "Tell me about the cattle." And so he did. It was the first real conversation they had, not the careful, measured letters, not the cautious exchange at the train platform, but an actual conversation, the kind that finds its rhythm and follows it. He told her about his herd, 23 head, mostly mixed stock, 2 good breeding cows he was particularly counting on for spring calves, a bull that was reliable but aging and would need replacing within 2 years if the herd was going to keep its quality. He told her about the fencing problems along the east pasture, the section that kept failing because the soil in that corner of the land was different, heavier, prone to shifting, which meant the posts didn't hold the way they should. Margaret listened the way she listened, completely, without interrupting, asking a question only when she needed clarification on something specific. "What are you running for winter forage?" she asked. "Hay I put up in August, and I've been supplementing with grain when the pasture's too frozen for grazing." "How much hay?" He told her. She calculated without making a show of it. "That might be tight if we get a long cold stretch in February. Do you have a source for additional hay if you need it?" "There's a man named Duer, 8 miles north. He usually has surplus." "At what price?" Caleb told her. She nodded slowly. "It'd be worth buying an extra 3 tons now while it's still available and before prices go up in January. Even if you don't need it, you can sell it back in spring and lose very little." He looked at her across the table. "You know livestock," he said. It wasn't a question, but it had the sound of something being reconsidered. "I managed 40 head for 30 years with my husband, and then 12 head on my own for 3 years after. Yes, I know livestock." She said it without pride, just as a fact. "I know farm accounting, too, if you'll let me look at your record sometime. Not to pry, only because I can usually find where money is going sideways before it becomes a problem." He didn't answer right away. She could see him deciding whether that felt like an offer or an intrusion, and she watched him land somewhere in the middle. "Maybe," he said. She let it go. That was enough for the first night. She was up at 5 the next morning, not because she was trying to prove anything, simply because 5 o'clock was when she had always gotten up, and a new house didn't change a 40-year habit. She built the fire in the stove, carefully, clearing the ash bed first, checking the damper, listening for any sounds from the flue that would indicate last night's warning about the chimney was more urgent than she'd let on. The flue sounded clear enough. She'd feel better after a proper sweeping, but it would hold for now. She had coffee going and the beginnings of a proper porridge on the stove when she heard movement from the room behind the partition, Caleb's room, and then boots on the floor, and then he appeared in the doorway in his work clothes, stopping when he saw the stove lit and smelled the coffee. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I was up anyway." She gestured toward the table. "Sit. You can tell me the morning routine." "I usually just—" He looked at the porridge. "I usually just have bread. That's not enough for a man doing physical work in December," she said flatly. "Sit." He sat. She learned the morning routine while they ate. He was in the barn by first light, checking the animals, feeding, breaking ice in the water trough if the night had been cold enough, then fencing rounds if anything needed attention, then whatever the day required after that, repairs, supply runs to town, work on the land itself. He ate midday at whatever point he could, usually something cold from the shelf, and supper in the early evening before dark. "You eat cold food at midday?" Margaret said. "Takes too long to come inside and cook. Takes 10 minutes to wrap something that'll stay warm in your coat." He opened his mouth. "I'm not criticizing," she said before he could speak. "I'm just saying it's fixable. A man working in cold weather needs warm food at midday, or he's spending half his body's energy just staying warm instead of doing the work." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "My husband used to argue with me about this exact thing for the first 15 years we were married. Then he stopped arguing because he noticed he was less exhausted on the days he ate properly." "What changed his mind?" "I stopped presenting it as an argument and started just packing the food. Hard to argue with something that's already in your coat pocket." There was a pause. And then, unexpectedly, Caleb Mercer let out a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close enough to be recognizable as one's relative. "That's one approach," he said. "It works," she said, and she felt something loosen slightly in the air between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that wasn't the careful wariness of two strangers trying not to step wrong. What? The first week was an education for both of them. Margaret moved through the house with the particular efficiency of a woman who knew that comfort was something you built, not something you waited for. She resealed the window, properly, with strips of oiled cloth tucked into the frame and a wedge of pine she found in the woodpile, which immediately made the main room perceptibly warmer. She reorganized the food stores, moving the cornmeal into a tin container she found in the back of the storage shed during her first inspection of it, arranging the shelves so that what got used most was closest to hand rather than buried behind what Caleb had acquired over time without much system. She swept the chimney herself on the second day, climbing up in the cold with a brush she found hanging in the barn and working at it for the better part of an hour, which she did not tell Caleb about until she was back inside, and he came in from the pasture to find her covered in soot at the kitchen table drinking coffee with the matter-of-fact expression of someone who had simply completed a task. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "I would have done that," he said. "You'd have done it eventually," she agreed. "It needed doing now." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He went to wash up. She also found, on her third day, the ledger. It was sitting on the shelf behind the pepper and the tin of nails, which was why she'd mentioned the nails in the first place. There was no sensible reason to keep a tin of nails next to food supplies, but when she moved it, she found the ledger underneath, and she looked at it for a moment and then left it where it was. She wasn't ready to ask about the ledger yet, but she thought about it, because in her 3 days on the property, she had seen a ranch that had the bones of something good. Solid land, adequate water from a well that seemed properly maintained, a herd that was smaller than it should be for 50 acres but not beyond recovering. What she hadn't seen was any sign that the operation was growing. Everything seemed to be holding at a level just above failure without moving toward anything better. A man who'd worked the same land for 9 years and was still running 23 head on 50 acres, that had the shape of a problem, and the problem was usually either money or will, and nothing about Caleb Mercer suggested it was will. She filed this away the way she filed everything, in an orderly mental shelf for when the time was right. The town was called Millhaven. She went for the first time on the 5th day, riding alongside Caleb on the wagon for the 8 miles into town for supplies. It was a Thursday, which turned out to be a mistake, because Thursday was when the women who had time to gather gathered, and Margaret was the most interesting new thing to arrive in Millhaven in some months. She was aware of the attention from the moment the wagon rolled down the main street. Aware in the way you are aware of eyes when you've spent enough time around people who judge. A particular kind of watchful quiet that precedes opinion. The general store was run by a man named Asa Pruitt, who was somewhere between 50 and 60, and had the manner of a man who knew everything that happened in a 20-mile radius and considered this his professional responsibility. He greeted Caleb with familiar ease and Margaret with the sort of careful courtesy that wasn't quite warmth. "This must be the lady from Missouri," Pruitt said. "Margaret Holloway," she said, and put her hand out to shake, which seemed to briefly catch him off guard. "Pruitt, Asa Pruitt." He shook her hand. "I heard Caleb had, well, that you'd come to, that is," he regrouped. "Welcome to Millhaven." "Thank you." She moved to the shelves and began reading them the way she'd read the ranch, systematically, noting prices and quantities, comparing what Caleb had on his list to what she could see was stocked. Behind her, she heard Pruitt say to Caleb, in what he probably considered a low voice, "Seems capable." "She is," Caleb said. "How old did you say?" "I didn't," Caleb said. His voice had gone flat. Pruitt redirected smoothly to the matter of the supplies. Outside the store, loading the wagon, Margaret said nothing about it. Caleb glanced at her sideways. "He didn't mean anything by it," he said. "He meant exactly what he said," Margaret replied without heat. "He's wondering why a man your age sent for a woman my age. It's a reasonable thing to wonder." She settled a bag of flour into the wagon bed. "I've been wondered about my whole life for one thing or another. I stopped minding it a long time ago." Caleb was quiet. He lifted the heavier bags without comment. They were almost done loading when a woman appeared at the corner of the store. About 40, well-dressed for the frontier, with an assessing look that she made no attempt to hide. She introduced herself as Vera Slade, wife of the owner of the neighboring Double S Ranch, and she had the tone of a woman who occupied a certain social position in Millhaven and expected this to be acknowledged. "You're the one who came from Missouri," Vera said, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of a statement that is waiting to become a question. "That's right," Margaret said. "I heard Caleb that he'd written to some agency." A small pause, delicate as a needle. "Quite a journey for someone your age." Margaret looked at her. "I'm 56, she said pleasantly. "Not dead." Vera blinked. Margaret climbed up onto the wagon seat. "It was nice to meet you, Mrs. Slade." She looked at Caleb. "Ready when you are." They drove out of Millhaven with the supplies in the wagon bed and the sound of Millhaven's opinions reforming behind them, and Caleb didn't say anything for a full mile, and then he said, "That was the cleanest thing I've ever seen done with 4 words." "I've had practice," Margaret said. "I believe it." She looked out at the flat winter land. "They're going to talk about us no matter what. People in small towns always do. The only question is whether you let it change what you do on your own land." "I never have," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we'll get along fine." She found the account book 6 days after arriving. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been reorganizing the shelf by the door, which held an accumulation of papers, nails, old invoices, a broken pocket watch, and 3 separate pieces of rope of different lengths for no reason she could determine. And the book had been underneath all of it, a plain brown ledger, its cover warped from a past encounter with moisture. She put it on the table and left it there. When Caleb came in that evening, she was at the stove, and the ledger was sitting in the middle of the table where he couldn't miss it. He stopped, looked at the ledger, looked at her. "Where did you find that?" "Under the shelf by the door, beneath what I believe is every invoice you've received since 1875. His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to go through—" "I wasn't going through it. I was cleaning the shelf." "There's a difference." She turned from the stove. "I didn't open it, but I'd like to, if you'll let me. What I've seen this past week tells me your land should be doing better than it is. I'd like to understand why it isn't." The silence that followed was long enough that she turned back to the stove, because she'd learned already that Caleb Mercer did not make decisions faster because someone was watching him make them. "After supper," he said finally. "All right." So after supper, with the cold pressing at the windows and the stove ticking warmly to itself, they sat at that table with 2 cups of coffee and the brown ledger between them, and Margaret opened it and started reading. And Caleb sat across from her and watched her face the way a man watches a doctor examining something he's been worried about for years. She read for a long time without speaking. The ledger told a story she recognized. Not a story of laziness or carelessness. The records were neat, meticulous even, entered in Caleb's careful hand. It was a story of a man who worked extremely hard to maintain exactly what he had. Every purchase carefully recorded, every sale, every expense. The problem was the pattern. Year after year, the numbers arrived at roughly the same place. Income covered costs, nothing more. "You're not investing back into the herd," she said. "I've been keeping them from declining. That's not nothing." "No, it's not. But you've been running this ranch for 9 years and you have 23 head. At this land's capacity, you should have 40. She traced a column with her finger. "Here, 1876, you had money after the fall sale to buy 2 more breeding cows. You didn't." He was quiet. "Why not?" The silence again, longer this time. "Because the previous year I'd put money into something that didn't work out," he said. His voice had changed texture. "A partnership with a man I trusted. It went badly." Margaret looked up from the ledger. He was looking at the table, not at her, and his jaw had the set of something that had been held that way for a very long time. "How badly?" she asked, quietly. "Badly enough that I almost lost the land." A pause. "After that, I didn't want to overextend again. I'd rather hold what I have than risk losing it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the ledger. "That's understandable," she said. Not with pity, just with the plainness of a woman saying what she actually thought. He looked up at her. "But it's costing you," she continued. "Fear of loss is an expense too. It just doesn't show up in the ledger. You've been running this place at exactly the level that keeps it alive but never lets it grow. And another 9 years of that, the land is still going to be worth what it's worth today." She closed the ledger gently. "You don't have to tell me what happened with the partnership. That's your business. But if you want this ranch to be something different than it is, you're going to have to make some different decisions." He didn't answer right away. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had come up since supper, moving across the flat Kansas land with the low continuous sound of something that intended to stay. "What would you do?" he said, "if it were your decision?" She thought about that. Not the way people think when they're performing consideration. She actually thought about it, working through what she'd seen in 6 days, what the ledger showed, what she knew about cattle and land and markets. 2 breeding cows in spring," she said. "Good ones. And I'd fix the east fencing properly. Not the patches you've been doing, but the whole section replaced. It costs more now and saves you money every season after." She paused. "And I'd let me look at where your supply costs are going. I think you're paying more than you need to at Pruitt's because you're buying in small amounts. If we buy in larger quantities, we spend less per unit, and we're not dependent on whatever his stock happens to be." Caleb looked at her. "That's a lot of changes for someone who's been here 6 days, he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You can tell me to mind my own business." "Is this not your business?" She met his eyes. He held the question there between them without flinching, and she understood suddenly that this was his way of saying something he didn't have the habit of saying directly. "I suppose it is," she said. He picked up his coffee. "I'll think about the cows," he said. That was not a no. She had learned enough about Caleb Mercer in 6 days to understand that from him, that was something considerably closer to yes. She picked up her own cup and they sat for a while in the warmth of the kitchen while the wind worked at the prairie outside, and it was not comfortable between them. Not easy, not settled. There was still so much they didn't know about each other, so much that hadn't been said. The weight of his past sitting in that ledger, and the weight of her own past sitting in the cedar box upstairs where she'd put his letter. But it was something. It was the specific something of 2 people who are beginning, very carefully, to figure out whether they can trust each other. And outside, the Kansas winter pressed on, patient and indifferent, the way the land always was, waiting to see what the people on it were made of. He thought about the cows for 4 days. Margaret knew he was thinking about it because he stopped talking about the herd in the abstract way he talked about it before, the way a man talks about something he's accepted as fixed, and started asking occasional specific questions. What breed would she recommend for this climate? Whether she thought a heifer or a proven cow was the better investment at this stage. What her experience had been with the particular challenges of calving in Kansas winters versus Missouri ones. She answered each question directly, without drawing attention to the fact that he was asking them, because she understood that this was how he processed things, and pushing him faster than his own pace would only make him dig in. On the 4th day he came in from the pasture at midday, which he'd started doing more regularly because she'd been wrapping something warm in cloth and leaving it in his coat pocket each morning without comment, and he'd stopped pretending he hadn't noticed. And he sat down at the table and said, "There's a man named Aldrich in Abilene who breeds good shorthorns. I've looked at his stock before, never bought from him because the timing wasn't right." Margaret poured him coffee. "Is the timing right now?" "I don't know yet." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'd want to see what he has before I commit to anything." "That's sensible." "I'd have to go to Abilene. Probably 2 days there and back." He looked at her. "You'd be here alone." "I've been alone before." "On a ranch, in weather, She looked at him evenly. "Mr. Mercer, I managed 40 acres alone for 3 winters. I know how to be alone on a ranch in weather that's trying to kill me. I'll be fine." He drank his coffee. "I'm not doubting you." "You're worrying," she said. "That's different. Worrying is fine." Something shifted in his expression, brief, barely visible, like a card turned just enough to see its face before it was turned back. "I'll write to Aldrich first," he said. "See what he has before I make the trip." That was December. By the 3rd week of the month, Aldrich had written back with a description of 2 proven shorthorn cows that made Margaret read the letter twice and then set it down with the careful restraint of someone who wanted to say, "Buy both of them immediately," and understood that saying so too quickly would accomplish the opposite. "Good stock," she said. "His price is fair," Caleb said. He was reading the letter again, or pretending to. She suspected he'd already memorized it. "It is. Spring delivery would work better. Let the worst of winter pass." "Agreed." He set the letter down. "I'll write back today." She went back to the bread she was making, and she did not point out that 2 weeks ago he'd been a man who hadn't invested in his herd for 3 years, because there was no need to point it out. And pointing things out when they didn't need pointing out was a way of making a person feel managed, and she had not come all the way to Kansas to manage Caleb Mercer. Christmas came and went quietly. Neither of them made much of it. Caleb's nearest neighbors, a family named Garfield, with 3 children and a wagon that had seen better days, came by on Christmas morning with a jar of honey and stayed for coffee, and Margaret produced a dried apple cake from supplies she'd been accumulating for 2 weeks, which seemed to surprise Caleb in the specific way that small evidence of planning surprises a person who lives mostly in the present tense. The Garfields were decent people. The husband, Frank, was younger than Caleb by a few years, lean and weathered and with the kind of permanent anxiety around the eyes that came from farming land that was always threatening to not be enough. His wife, Louise, was 32 and visibly tired in the way of women with 3 children under 8 who loved their family and had long since stopped having the energy to pretend it wasn't exhausting. Louise gravitated to Margaret in the way that women on the frontier gravitated toward other women. Not because they necessarily had things in common, but because female company was scarce and the hunger for it was real. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and watched Margaret move around the kitchen and said, with a frankness that seemed to be simply her natural register, "I heard about you before you even got here, "I imagine you did," Margaret said. Vera Slade told everyone at the dry goods that Caleb had sent to some marriage registry for a woman old enough to be his mother. Louise seemed to realize how this sounded. "I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong." "No, you're saying it right," Margaret said. That's probably what she said. She meant it as a criticism. Louise wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't take it that way. I thought it sounded like a man who knew what he actually needed." Margaret looked at her. "That's a generous reading." Maybe. Louise glanced toward the main room, where Caleb and Frank were talking about something involving fence post costs. Is it working, if you don't mind me asking? Margaret considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. 3 weeks on the ranch, the ledger open on the table, the chimney swept, the window properly sealed, 2 shorthorn cows coming in spring, a man who'd started eating warm food at midday and was still pretending it was his own idea. We're figuring it out, she said. That's all anybody does. Louise nodded slowly. Frank and I figured it out for 4 years before it started feeling like something. I kept thinking there should be a moment when it clicked, like a lock. There wasn't. It just got easier, gradually. She smiled, tired and genuine. I hope it does for you too. Thank you, Margaret said, and she meant it. Bull, January arrived the way January always arrived in Kansas. Not as a weather event so much as a condition, a state of being that the land settled into and expected you to settle into as well. The cold was a different animal than December's cold. December cold was sharp and sudden and insulting. January cold was patient. It didn't surprise you. It just pressed. The ranch's routine had found its shape by then. Caleb in the barn at first light, Margaret with the stove and the morning meal, the midday check, the afternoon work, the supper and the quiet evenings in the kitchen where they developed the habit of sitting for an hour after eating. Him with whatever mending or small repairs needed doing, her with the mending or the ledger, which she'd been working through systematically, tracking patterns across the years with the patient thoroughness of a woman who'd spent her adult life figuring out where things went wrong before they got there. They talked during those evenings. Not always. Not abundantly. But more than either of them would have predicted 6 weeks ago. The conversation had the quality of 2 people who'd discovered they could disagree without either of them treating it as a disaster, which turned out to be rarer than it should have been in Margaret's experience. They disagreed about the east fencing. She wanted the full section replaced. He was inclined to repair the worst posts and see if that held through spring. They debated it across 3 evenings with the ledger between them and a rough sketch of the property line Caleb drew on the back of an old invoice, and neither of them fully won, which meant they landed on a compromise. Replace the 4 worst posts now, and if they lost more than 2 additional posts before summer, replace the whole section. That's reasonable, Margaret said, which was her way of accepting without fully conceding. It is, Caleb agreed, which was his way of acknowledging she'd moved him without making him say so directly. They disagreed about Roman, who had healed well from his fetlock issue, but had subsequently developed a habit of testing the barn gate that Caleb was inclined to accommodate by reinforcing the gate, and Margaret felt should be corrected behaviorally before it became something worse. He's not being difficult, Caleb said. He's bored. He's bored because he's testing the gate and it's working, Margaret said. If the gate holds, he'll find something else to do. If you keep reinforcing it every time he tests it, you're teaching him that testing things gets results. A pause. That's a philosophical argument about a horse. It's a practical argument about not spending 3 hours reinforcing a gate every time he gets restless. She looked at him. What do you do when he pushes the gate? I tell him to stop. And does he? For a while. Right, she said. He fixed the gate and also started giving Roman 15 minutes of additional movement in the evening, which he did not connect to the conversation, or at least did not connect to it out loud, and Roman stopped testing the gate within a week. Margaret did not say anything about this. She was learning the grammar of him, the way he processed things slowly and thoroughly and didn't like to be caught processing them, the way he showed consideration through action rather than words. The morning she woke to find the loft ladder had been fitted with a proper handrail that hadn't been there the night before. The evening she came back from a walk to check the east fence herself and found that he'd moved the spare blanket from the trunk in the barn to the hook inside the back door, where it would be available if she came in cold. Small things. Quiet things. Things a person could miss if they weren't paying attention. Margaret paid attention. The trouble with the town started in earnest the second week of January, and it started, as trouble often did, with something that seemed small. She had gone into Millhaven alone. Caleb was dealing with a section of water pipe that had frozen and cracked overnight and couldn't be left. With a list of supplies and the reasonable expectation of returning inside 2 hours. The trip was fine until she was loading the wagon outside Pruitt's store, and Vera Slade appeared with another woman Margaret didn't know, and the other woman said something in a voice pitched just below the level of being meant to be overheard, but not quite below the level of being heard. Surprised she manages the trip in this cold, at her age, Margaret loaded a 50-pound flour sack into the wagon without looking up. Wonder what he was thinking, sending for someone like... She loaded the cornmeal. Practically old enough to be his mother, and not even... Margaret straightened up and looked at the two women directly. The other woman, she had the angular look of someone who had opinions and kept them sharp, met her eyes and did not look away. This was either bravery or rudeness, and Margaret wasn't sure it mattered which. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, pleasantly. "Were you speaking to me or about me? I want to make sure I'm responding to the right thing." A beat of silence. "We weren't," Vera started. "Because if you were speaking to me," Margaret continued, same pleasant tone, "I'm happy to have whatever conversation you're trying to have. And if you were speaking about me, you might as well know I can hear fine at 56. My hearing is one of the things that hasn't given me any trouble yet." The other woman's jaw tightened. "We were only—" "I know what you were only," Margaret said. She did not raise her voice because a woman who raised her voice lost the exchange. "You're wondering why Caleb Mercer sent for a woman my age. That's a fair thing to wonder. The answer is because he needed someone who knew what she was doing, and age tends to come with that." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "If either of you ever need to know something about cattle, soil preparation, food storage, or winter livestock management, I'm happy to help. Good morning." She drove out. Her hands were steady on the reins. Her jaw was tight, but she breathed through it, the way she'd been breathing through things for 56 years. And by the time the town was a mile behind her, the tightness had eased, and she was just a woman driving 8 miles home on a cold January morning. She didn't mention it to Caleb, not because she was hiding it, because it didn't need to be mentioned. She hadn't come to Kansas to be protected from small-town gossip. She'd come to work a ranch. But Millhaven had ears, and within 3 days Caleb had heard something. She could tell by the way he came in from town on the Friday. There was a particular set to his shoulders, a compressed quality in his movement, like a man keeping something in, and he sat down at the table and didn't speak for a moment. "Pruitt told me what happened outside his store," he said. "Nothing happened," Margaret said. "A woman said something unkind, and I answered her. That's all." "Who was it?" "I don't know her name. She was with Vera Slade." "Eleanor Marsh." His voice was flat. "Her husband and I have never gotten on." "That's got nothing to do with me." "No, but she's making it about you because it's more useful to her than making it about me." He looked at the table. "I'm sorry, I didn't think about... When I wrote to the agency, I thought about what I needed. I didn't think about what it would be like for you, coming here and being looked at the way you're going to be looked at." Margaret sat down across from him. She thought about how to say what she wanted to say. "Caleb," she said. She'd started using his first name somewhere around the 3rd week, neither of them making a point of it. It had simply happened. "I am 56 years old. I have been looked at my whole life. Too young, too old, too quiet, too forward, too plain, too competent. Not competent enough depending on who was looking. I have been a young wife, and a middle-aged farmer's wife, and a widow, and now I am apparently the strange old bride who arrived from Missouri. And what I have learned across all of that is that people's opinions of me are mostly about them." She paused. "I did not come here to be sheltered from the world. I came here because I needed somewhere to be useful. Whether Vera Slade approves of the arrangement is genuinely not a thing I lose sleep over." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face had shifted, not the recalibrating look from the train platform. This was different, more careful. "What do you lose sleep over?" he asked. The question surprised her. It was more direct than he usually was, and she understood from the way he asked it that it had cost him something to ask. She thought about it honestly. "Whether the work I do is worth something," she said. whether the decisions I make are the right ones, whether I'm seeing things clearly or seeing them the way I want to see them. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The same things most people lose sleep over, I imagine. Not the same things I expected, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Simpler worries. He looked at his own cup. The way people talk. Once a person gets to a certain age, you'd think they stop worrying about things mattering, that they've settled into it. The things that matter never stop mattering, she said. You just get better at carrying them. He was quiet for a while. The stove made its sounds. Outside the window, the January darkness pressed against the glass. The east fence, he said eventually. What about it? I think you were right about replacing the whole section, not the compromise, the whole thing. He looked at her. I've been patching things that need replacing for too long. The fence is part of it. Margaret looked at him. She understood that he was not only talking about the fence. We can order the materials from Pruitt next week, she said. I'll help with the setting. You don't need to... 4-hand set fence faster than 2, she said. That's not an argument. It's arithmetic. He almost smiled. Fine. Cheb. February came in cold and stayed. It was the coldest stretch Margaret had experienced in Kansas, though she'd been warned enough to have prepared for it. The extra hay from Dwyer was already in the barn. The supply stores were full, the window sealed, the chimney drawing clean. The ranch was as ready as she could make it, and she understood that ready was never the same as safe, but it was what you had. The blizzard arrived on a Wednesday night in the second week of February. It didn't announce itself the way storms sometimes did, a pressure drop, a particular color in the western sky. It simply came, the wind picking up after supper until it was a sound like nothing so much as intention, and then the snow beginning in the way Kansas blizzard snow began. Not gently, not gradually, but fully committed from the first minute. Caleb came in from the barn at 8 o'clock with ice in his beard and said, The mare, Duchess. She's been restless all evening. I think she's close. Margaret had watched Duchess for 2 weeks. The mare was carrying her first foal, which was itself a risk, and she was big in a way that suggested the foal might be large, which was a bigger risk. She'd mentioned this to Caleb in early February, and he'd nodded with the expression of a man who was hoping she was wrong and knew she probably wasn't. How close? Margaret said. I don't know. Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow. He went to the window and looked out at the snow driving sideways past the glass. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. I'm going to go back out and stay close. He was pulling his coat back on. If she goes into labor tonight, you'll need help. I'll manage. Caleb. She said it the way she said things when she meant them to land. A first foal in a blizzard from a mare who's been carrying large. That's not a one-person job. It's cold out there. It's going to get colder. I'm aware of that. I've been outside. She was already moving toward her coat on the hook by the door. What do you need from the house first? He looked at her. That particular look, the one she'd first seen on the train platform, of a man encountering something he hadn't prepared for. But there was something else in it now, something that had been accumulating since December, since the ledger and the fence and the coffee cups and the conversations in the kitchen, since she'd learned the grammar of him. There's rope in the barn, he said. Bucket by the door. I'll need the lamp from the shelf. Get the lamp, she said. I'll get the bucket and my boots. The barn was loud with wind even through the walls. The lantern Caleb hung from the center beam threw a yellow, unsteady light across the stalls, and in the far stall, Duchess was down, which meant things had moved faster than Caleb expected, and the sound she was making was the low, straining sound of an animal in serious labor. Margaret had been present for cattle births and 2 horse births in her life, and she knew immediately that this was not straightforward. The mare's breathing was wrong, too rapid, too shallow, and the position she'd taken told Margaret what she needed to know about how the foal was presenting. She's been straining too long already, she said, not a question. Since before I came inside. Caleb was already crouched beside the mare, his voice low and steady, the voice you used with animals in distress. It's not coming right. The foal is turned. I think so. Margaret knelt in the straw. The cold inside the barn was serious cold, not the killing cold that waited outside. The barn walls holding enough of the heat the animals generated to make the difference, but cold enough that she could see her breath, cold enough that her hands ached as soon as she pulled her gloves off. She needed to feel what was happening. She did what needed doing. It was not a clean or comfortable business, and she did not think about clean or comfortable. She thought about the foal and the mare and the specific problem in front of her, and she worked with her hands in the straw and the cold, while Caleb held the lantern and kept his hand on Duchess's neck and spoke to her in the low, steady voice, and the wind pressed against the barn walls with a sound like it was trying to get in. "The foal's front legs are back," Margaret said. Her hands were very cold. "If we can get them forward, can you reach?" "I'm trying." She was not going to say she was afraid she couldn't. She worked with what she had, her hands, her knowledge, 30 years of paying attention to things that mattered. And she reached into the space that the mare was giving her, and she felt the problem, and she worked at it with the patient, careful, focused intention of someone who understood that the only thing that mattered right now was the next thing that needed doing. It took time. She couldn't have said how long. Time in a barn in a blizzard with an animal in labor doesn't move the way time usually moves. It compresses into the single urgent present, each moment only the thing happening in it. The foal's legs came forward. "All right," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hands. "Caleb," when she strains again, "I know," he said. They both knew. When Duchess gathered herself and strained, Caleb helped and Margaret helped, and the foal came, ungainly and sudden and alive. A dark bay filly with her mother's big shoulders and 4 spindly legs that had no idea yet what they were for. And Margaret sat back on her heels in the straw and let out a breath that was 3 hours of held tension releasing all at once. Caleb was already with the foal, clearing, checking, his hands moving with the sureness of a man who knew his animals. The filly made a sound, small and indignant, the sound of a new creature experiencing the world and not being certain about it. And Duchess raised her head toward it. Margaret's hands were shaking. She noticed this and accepted it. The shaking was fine. The shaking happened after, when you'd gotten through the thing you were doing and the body took back the tension it had been holding in service of getting through it. She became aware that she was very cold, that her coat was soaked through at the front, that the straw under her was wet, that the lantern was still swinging slightly from a hook in the beam and throwing moving shadows across the walls. She became aware that Caleb was looking at her. He was still crouched by the foal, one hand on the filly's side to feel her breathing, but his eyes were on Margaret, and his expression was something she didn't have a category for yet. Not gratitude, or not only gratitude, something that had more weight to it than that. "She's breathing well," he said, about the foal, but he kept looking at Margaret. "Good." Margaret's voice came out rougher than she expected. She cleared her throat. "The mare needs water, and we should stay close for another hour to make sure—" "Margaret." She stopped. He almost never said her name without a reason. "What you just did," he said. He stopped, seemed to be finding his way through something. "I've been on this land for 9 years. I've done things alone that I shouldn't have done alone because I'd gotten used to there not being anyone to do them with." He looked at the filly, who was trying to determine what her legs were for, with the intense concentration of the newly born. "I forgot what it was like to have somebody standing beside me." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Her hands were still shaking. Her coat was ruined. The straw was cold and wet, and the wind was not done with them yet. And she was 56 years old, kneeling in a Kansas barn in the middle of February, and she had never felt less like someone the world had overlooked. "Well," she said, "I'm here." It was not a complicated thing to say. It was the truest thing she had, and she said it plainly. The way she said all the true things, and Caleb Mercer heard it the way a man hears something that settles a question he'd been carrying for a long time without knowing it had a name. Outside, the blizzard pressed on. The barn held. The filly found her legs. They stayed in the barn until past midnight. The filly, Caleb named her February, which Margaret thought was either very practical or quietly sentimental, and she couldn't decide which, nursed for the first time just before 11, and Duchess settled into the patient, exhausted calm of a mare who had gotten through the hard part and knew it. Margaret changed the wet straw in the stall while Caleb checked the other horses, and by the time they walked back to the house, the blizzard had dropped from its peak intensity to a steady, committed snowfall that was going to be someone's problem in the morning. Inside, Margaret put water on for the stove and peeled off her ruined coat and hung it by the door where it dripped steadily onto the floorboards. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the 11th hour in the barn, but they still ached in the particular deep way of hands that had been very cold and had worked hard while cold. She stood at the stove and let the warmth come back into them. Caleb came in behind her and stopped when he saw the coat. "I'll get you another coat," he said. "It's fine, I can clean it. The front is—" He looked at it. "Margaret, I'll get you another coat." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was not a man who repeated himself unnecessarily. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He sat down at the table and pulled off his boots, and she made 2 cups of something hot and set one in front of him without being asked, and they sat in the kitchen at 1 in the morning in the aftermath of the blizzard and the barn and the filly, and neither of them spoke for several minutes. The house was warm. Outside the snow fell and fell. "You should have told me she was presenting wrong earlier," he said finally. Not as a criticism, more like a man filing something away. "I didn't know for certain until I was in there," she said. "Before that it was a possibility. I didn't want to say something definite until I was sure. Still," he turned the cup in his hands. "Next time, tell me the possibility." "All right," she said. "Next time I'll tell you the possibility." He looked at the table. Then he said, without quite looking up, "What you did tonight, not a lot of people would have come out in that. You would have managed, maybe, but not as well." He did look up then. "That's not something I say easily." She knew that. She'd learned that about him over 2 months of evenings at this table, that he was a man for whom acknowledgement cost something real, not because he was selfish with it, but because he'd spent so long in his own company that the words had gotten out of practice. When he said something like that, he meant it in the full weight of its plainness. "I know," she said. The morning after the blizzard, Millhaven dug itself out. The snow had come down hard enough to close the road from the ranch to town for 2 full days. And when it opened again and Caleb made the first supply run, he came back with information the way men who didn't gossip came back with information, as incidental report delivered without editorial. "Slade's lost 4 head, he said, unloading the wagon. "His south pasture fence gave in the storm. Cattle scattered and 2 were found dead and 2 more haven't turned up." Margaret was stacking firewood. "He didn't bring them in before the storm?" "Apparently he thought his fencing would hold." She stacked another piece of wood. "Did you tell him about the hay from Duer before the winter?" "I mentioned it." "Did he do it?" Caleb's expression answered that. She didn't say anything more about it. That was Slade's cattle and Slade's fencing and Slade's decision, and it was not her place to say anything beyond what she thought privately, which was that a man who let his wife look down on other people's preparations might have paid more attention to his own. What she did not expect was Vera Slade appearing at the ranch 3 days later. Margaret was alone. Caleb was at the east fence working on the replacement post they'd finally ordered, and she was in the middle of rendering fat for the soap she'd been meaning to make since January, which was not glamorous work, when she heard the wagon. She looked out the window and recognized Vera Slade's good driving horse and did not immediately know what to do with this information. She went to the door. Vera was coming up the path with the careful footing of a woman navigating frozen mud in boots that were not quite practical enough for it. She was alone. No Eleanor Marsh, no buffer of company. She looked cold, and she looked like a person who had decided to do something and was committed to it before she could change her mind. "Mrs. Slade," Margaret said. "Mrs. Holloway." Vera stopped at the base of the porch step. She was a handsome woman. Margaret had always registered that, somewhere in her early 40s, with a self-possessed quality that in other circumstances Margaret might have found admirable. Right now, she had the look of someone who had rehearsed something and was second-guessing the rehearsal. "I wonder if I might speak with you." "Come inside," Margaret said. "I've got the stove going." She stepped back. After a moment, Vera came in. She looked around the kitchen. Margaret saw her looking, the quick assessment that women who were conscious of domestic arrangements always made, and Margaret watched something shift in her expression. The kitchen was not what it had been in December. The shelves were properly organized, the window sealed cleanly, the table scrubbed, the stove surrounded by a careful arrangement of tools and supplies that spoke of someone who knew what each thing was for. I've been wanting to. Vera stopped, started again. I owe you an apology. Margaret turned from the stove where she was managing the rendered fat. For which specific thing? Vera's mouth tightened briefly at the directness, and then something released in her. For the things Eleanor said outside Pruitt's store. For not... I should have said something to her. I didn't. A pause. And for other things, I said myself. About you. Before you arrived, and after. Margaret looked at her. She was 56 years old, and she had been on the receiving end of plenty of apologies in her life, and she had learned to tell the difference between the ones that were about genuine remorse and the ones that were about the apologizer feeling better. This one, she thought, was the first kind. It was costing Vera Slade something to be here, and people who apologized easily didn't have that particular pinched quality around the eyes. Sit down, Margaret said. Do you take coffee? Yes, thank you. They sat at the table. Vera held the coffee cup with both hands, the way people did when they needed something to do with them. My husband lost 4 cattle in the storm, Vera said. I heard. He had more losses last winter, too. Different causes. She looked at her cup. The ranch has been struggling for 2 years. Howard doesn't like to discuss it. I didn't know how badly until I found his accounts in December. She was quiet for a moment. You were right, what you said outside the store. About age coming with knowledge. I said those things because I was... She seemed to be looking for the honest word. Afraid, I suppose, of being shown up by someone who knew more than I did. Margaret considered this. I wasn't trying to show anyone up, she said. I was trying to explain why I was here. I know that now, Vera looked at her directly. I wondered if you might be willing to talk with me about livestock management, about the kind of things you mentioned. A pause that took some courage. About what you've done here since you arrived. Caleb's place looks different than it did in October. Margaret thought about this for a moment. She thought about what it cost a woman like Vera Slade, who had built her position in Millhaven on the scaffold of social judgment and the ability to define who belonged and who didn't, to come to this kitchen and ask this question. She thought about whether pride was a good enough reason to send her away. What specifically are you concerned about? Margaret said. With the ranch? And Vera Slade, to her credit, answered honestly. She talked about the fencing, the hay stores, the breeding program her husband ran with no real system, the accounts she'd looked at in December with growing dread. She talked about the fact that Howard was a proud man who did not take advice readily and that she was trying to understand things well enough to present them in a way he could hear. Margaret recognized this dynamic. She had navigated 31 years of a marriage to a man she loved who also had strong opinions about being the one who knew things. The fencing first, Margaret said. Everything else can be addressed if the animals are secure. If you're losing cattle to fence failures in winter storms, you'll never recover the losses fast enough to get ahead. She reached for a piece of paper from the shelf. She kept paper on the shelf now, for exactly this kind of purpose, and started writing. Not the answers. The questions Vera should be asking. The things she needed to look at and understand before she could have the conversation with her husband. Vera watched her write. You just know all of this, she said. Not critically, with something more like honest surprise. I learned it the way everyone learns things, Margaret said, by paying attention for a long time and making a lot of mistakes, and paying attention to those too. She finished the list and pushed it across the table. Start with the fencing, and get last year's accounts from wherever your husband keeps them. Not to confront him, just to understand the shape of the problem before you try to solve it. Vera looked at the list, looked at Margaret. I said some unkind things, she said again. I want you to know I understand now why he chose you. Caleb chose me because I asked for honest work, and he needed someone who meant it, Margaret said. It's a simpler story than people made it. Maybe, Vera said, but not everyone would have stayed. She told Caleb about the visit that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Vera Slade came here, he said, as though making sure he had the facts correct. She did. And you helped her. I gave her some things to think about. Whether she does anything with them is up to her. He looked at the table. Howard Slade has never given me a reason to like him much. He was one of the louder voices saying I'd lost my mind when word got out about the agency letter. Margaret looked at him. I know, she told me. A pause. His opinion of you doesn't have anything to do with whether his ranch survives the winter. No, he said. I know that. He was quiet for a moment. It still doesn't make me like him. That's all right, she said. You don't have to like him. I didn't help him. I helped her. He looked at her then with the particular expression, the one that had been growing since the train platform, accumulating weight through the ledger and the fence and the cold morning coffee and the barn and February, the filly. And he said quietly, You're a different kind of person than I thought existed. What did you think existed? I don't know. Simpler things. He turned his cup. People who wanted one kind of life and got it, or didn't get it and were bitter. I didn't think... He stopped, seemed to feel his way through something unfamiliar. I didn't think a person could be as practical as you are, and also as... He stopped again. As what? She said. As decent, he said, like the word cost him something. At the same time. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My husband Robert used to say I was practical to a fault, she said. He meant it as a complaint sometimes. He was a man who liked to feel things dramatically, and I kept finding the sensible solution before he'd finished feeling the drama. She smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd let him see, the kind that reached the corners of her eyes. I miss the drama sometimes, now that it's gone. Caleb looked at her. Do you miss him? Yes. She said it without hesitation. Not the same way I did the first year. It changes, but yes. She looked at her cup. Does that bother you, that I still miss him? No, he said, and the steadiness in his voice told her he'd thought about it before she asked. She appreciated that. March came in with mud and a cruelty that passed for hope, warmer days that turned the snow to muck and made the roads nearly impassable for a week. Then a cold snap that froze the mud solid and cracked 2 more of the east fence posts, which settled the replacement question permanently. They ordered the full section of new fencing in the 3rd week of March, and when it arrived, Caleb spent 4 days setting posts with Frank Garfield, helping for 2 of them, and Margaret worked the stretching wire with a tool efficiency that made Frank Garfield stop once and look at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. You've done this before, Frank said. Many times, she said. Frank looked at Caleb. Caleb had the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by this and moved into something that looked like quiet satisfaction. Louise wants to know if you'd come for supper sometime, Frank said to Margaret. She's been wanting to properly. She liked meeting you at Christmas. I'd like that, Margaret said. She meant it. The fencing took the week. By the end of it, the east pasture boundary was solid in a way it hadn't been in years, and Caleb stood at the edge of the finished section on the last afternoon and looked at it for a long time. It's good work, he said. It is, she agreed. The whole property should have been this standard years ago. You're doing it now, she said. That's what matters. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was a particular quality to the silence between them in that moment. The cold spring air, the mud, the new fence posts pale against the old ones, the filly visible in the far pasture finding her legs with more confidence now, and she understood that something had been building in him for 4 months and was approaching the edge of where it could be contained in practical conversation. I need to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. He looked back at the fence first, then at her. When I wrote that letter to the agency, he said, I told myself I was being practical, sensible, that I needed help on the ranch and romance was a fool's game, and an older woman would understand the work for what it was. His jaw had the set of a man working through something honestly. I told myself I wasn't capable of, that I'd lost the capacity for anything beyond a working arrangement. She waited. I had a woman before, he said, 8 years ago, before I came to Kansas. She was young and she was bright, and I thought I'd found something real. I put everything into it. The partnership I mentioned, the one that went badly. It was connected to her. Her brother. I trusted him because I trusted her. He stopped. She left when the money was gone, not angrily, just matter-of-factly, like I'd been useful for a while and now I wasn't. Margaret looked at him steadily. So I came here, he said, and I worked, and I didn't let anything pass the practical level because the practical level was safe. He met her eyes. And then you stepped off that train and told me my horse was lame in the first 30 seconds, and I thought, all right, this is what sensible looks like. This is a person who operates in the same register I do. He paused. Except that's not what happened. What happened? She said, because he needed to finish it. What happened is that you are the most real person I've been in a room with in 8 years. And somewhere around the second week when you swept the chimney without telling me and came back covered in soot and drank your coffee like it was a completely ordinary thing to do, I understood that my original plan for this arrangement was not going to survive contact with you. Margaret looked at the fence for a moment, then at him. I'm 56 years old, she said. I have gray hair, and my hands are not the hands of a young woman, and I am not romantic in the way stories about women are supposed to be romantic. I know that. I am practical to a fault. I will tell you when you're wrong, and I will not be delicate about it. I don't have the patience for delicacy that I might have had 20 years ago. I know. I still miss my husband. I know that too. She looked at him. He was standing in the cold spring mud with his work coat and his hands that were also not the hands of a young man, and he was looking at her with the directness of a person who had finally run out of ways to look at something sideways. What are you asking me? She said. I'm asking if this is only a working arrangement, he said, because if it is, I can work with that. I'll manage. But I needed to say the other thing, because not saying it was starting to take up more energy than the ranch. The wind moved across the pasture. February looked up from the grass she was investigating, decided nothing interesting was happening, and went back to it. Margaret thought about the cedar box in the loft where she kept her husband's last letter and Caleb's first one. She thought about the 6 letters they'd exchanged before she ever got on the train, and the way she'd read that one line, I think I have been looking for someone like you for a long time without knowing that's what I was doing. 4 separate times. She had told herself, arriving at this ranch, that she was here for honest work and a place to be useful. That had been true. It was still true. But she was also 56 years old, not dead, and she had been paying attention for 4 months to a man who moved a handrail onto a loft ladder without mentioning it and left a warm blanket on a hook where she'd find it, and said, That's not something I say easily about a compliment, and meant every word of everything he said, always, because he never said anything he didn't mean. It's not only a working arrangement, she said. It hasn't been for a while. Something in his face, the whole compressed set of it, the 9 years of solitary, stubborn, careful living, shifted in a way that was not dramatic, was not a transformation, was simply the slight adjustment of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood in the mud by the new fence in the cold March air, and it was not a story's grand moment. Her boots were muddy. His coat had a tear in the left sleeve she'd been meaning to mend for 2 weeks. The pasture smelled of thaw and livestock, and the particular sharp smell of new-cut wood from the fence posts. Nothing about it was what people meant when they talked about romance. It was better than that. It was 2 people who had been honest with each other across 4 difficult months, standing on solid ground they had built together, saying the thing they'd been circling, and finding that the thing was real. That evening she wrote to her son in Missouri, the eldest, Thomas, who'd sent 2 letters since December asking cautious questions she'd answered carefully. And she wrote to him more plainly than she had before. The ranch is doing well. The spring shorthorns arrive in 3 weeks, and the east fencing is fully replaced, and I think we will have a good season. There is something I should also tell you, which is that this arrangement has become something I did not originally plan for and am not sorry about. Caleb Mercer is a good man, not a simple man, not without difficulty, but good in the ways that matter. He is honest, and he works hard, and he does not say things he doesn't mean. I thought you should know. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you because you are my son, and I believe you deserve to know how things stand with your mother. I am well. I am useful. I am, I think, where I am supposed to be." She sealed the letter and set it on the shelf to go with Caleb's next supply run. Then she went back to the kitchen where he was sitting with the evening's mending, and she poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and picked up the ledger, because the spring buying decisions needed to be made in the next 2 weeks, and the numbers wanted looking at. He glanced at her over whatever he was working on. A harness strap, the same one he'd been meaning to mend for 3 weeks. Looked at the ledger in her hands. Looked at her. "The Shorthorn delivery," he said. "Aldrich is bringing them the week after next. I thought you should be there when they arrive." "I'll be there," she said. He nodded and went back to the harness. She opened the ledger. Outside the window, the Kansas spring was making its slow, difficult argument for itself. Mud and cold and tentative light. And inside the kitchen, the stove made its sounds and the lamp burned yellow, and 2 people sat at the same table doing the quiet work of a life being built. Not all at once, not without difficulty, but one careful day at a time. The 2 shorthorn cows arrived on a Thursday morning in the last week of March, and they arrived with all the grace of livestock that had traveled 2 days in a wagon and had opinions about it. Aldrich was a lean, sun-worn man of about 60 who handled cattle the way people handle things they have spent their entire lives understanding, without drama, without excess motion, with the quiet authority of genuine knowledge. He brought the cows down the ramp himself, speaking to them in a low, continuous murmur that was less about the words than about the sound. And Margaret watched him work from the fence and felt the specific appreciation of one competent person observing another. Caleb had been right about the quality. These were good animals, deep through the chest, solid on their legs, with the calm temperament that good shorthorn breeding produced. The older of the 2, a 4-year-old with a broad roan face, stepped off the ramp and immediately began assessing the pasture with the focused interest of a cow who intended to eat well and wanted to know what she had to work with. "That one," Margaret said to Caleb, nodding at the roan. "I know," he said. He was already watching her. Aldrich heard this exchange and looked at Margaret with the direct, evaluating look of a man who takes stock of people the same way he takes stock of animals. "Your wife knows cattle," he said to Caleb. "She does," Caleb said. Aldrich looked back at the roan cow. "What do you see in her?" "The way she moved off the ramp," Margaret said. "No hesitation, no stumbling, straight to grazing. An animal that travels badly takes time to settle. She didn't need time. That's constitution." She looked at the younger cow, a 3-year-old with cleaner lines but a slightly more anxious quality to her movement. "The younger one is better looking, but she'll need more management. Worth it if the breeding lines hold." Aldrich studied her for a moment. "You're from Missouri." "I am." "What stock did you run?" She told him, and they talked for 20 minutes at the fence line while Caleb finished the paperwork and the cows found their place in the pasture. And at the end of it, Aldrich shook her hand with the firm grip of a man who had decided she was worth the gesture and said, "If you ever have questions about the breeding program, you write to me directly, not through the husband." Margaret appreciated that more than she said. Spring came properly in April, and it transformed the ranch in the way Kansas springs transform things. Not gently, not gradually, but with a sudden insistence that caught you slightly off guard no matter how long you'd been watching for it. The pasture greened up fast after the long mud of March, and February the filly, 3 months old now and entirely confident in her legs, ran the fence line in the mornings with an energy that made even the work-seasoned horses watch her with something that looked like nostalgia. Thomas arrived in April. Margaret's son had written in March to say he was coming, and she had written back to say the spare room in the loft was available and the ranch was a working operation, and he should not expect comfort, and he had written back to say he understood, and then he arrived, and it was immediately clear that understanding and experiencing were different things. Thomas Holloway was 43 years old, which meant he was 5 years older than the man his mother had come to Kansas to marry. And this arithmetic was visible on his face from the moment Caleb shook his hand. He was a decent man, Thomas. Margaret knew her children honestly, which meant she knew their faults as well as their virtues. And Thomas's main fault was that he loved her in the specific worried way of a firstborn child who had been the man of the house at 17 when his father first got sick and had never quite stopped feeling responsible for things. He walked the ranch with Caleb the first afternoon, and Margaret stayed in the kitchen and did not follow them because some conversations needed to happen without a mother present, and she trusted Caleb to be honest and trusted Thomas to be fair eventually, even if fair took him a day or two to arrive at. They came back an hour later and ate supper with the particular careful politeness of two men who are deciding what to think of each other, and Margaret fed them both and watched them without appearing to watch them. After supper, Thomas helped her wash the dishes, an old habit from childhood, the two of them at the basin while Robert sat on the porch. And he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "The fence on the east side is new. We put it in last month. The barn's in good repair, better than I expected from your letters. We've been working on it since December." Thomas turned a plate in his hands. He's not what I pictured." "What did you picture?" "I don't know. Someone who needed a housekeeper and called it a marriage." He set the plate on the shelf. "He's not that." "No," Margaret said. "He's not." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, the way children look at their parents when they're trying to update an old picture with a new one. She let him look. She was not going to make it easier by performing either happiness or reassurance. He was 43 years old, and he could handle the truth of what he was seeing. "You look different than you did in Missouri," he said finally. "Do I?" "You look—" He seemed to be finding the honest word. "Less tired, which is strange because I imagine you're working harder." "Working the right work doesn't tire you the same way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy, Ma?" She thought about the question the way she thought about all important questions. Actually, not quickly. "I'm not sure happy is exactly the right word," she said. "I'm useful. I'm respected. I'm somewhere that needs what I have and uses it." She handed him the last dish. "That's more than most people get. And yes, underneath all of that, which is real and enough on its own, yes, I am." Thomas put the dish on the shelf. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. "Pa would have liked him," he said. "That's what I think. He would have found him too quiet, but he would have respected him." Margaret felt something move through her chest at that. Robert's presence, familiar and bittersweet, there and then gone. "That means something," she said. "I know." Thomas turned around. "I'm sorry it took me this long to come. I should have come sooner." "You're here now," she said. "That's enough." Thomas stayed for a week. By the end of it, he and Caleb had reached the particular understanding that men who work alongside each other arrive at. Not warmth, not yet, but the solid foundation of mutual respect that warmth can eventually be built on. They fixed the chicken coop together on the third day without anyone suggesting it, simply because Thomas noticed it needed doing and Caleb had the materials. And by the time they were done, the conversation between them had found its footing. The morning Thomas left, he shook Caleb's hand in the yard and said something Margaret couldn't hear from the porch, and Caleb listened and nodded and said something back, and Thomas looked at the ground and nodded too, and that was that. She didn't ask what was said. She had her guesses. Thomas hugged her on the porch, such he was Robert's height, had always been Robert's height, which still caught her sometimes, and said into her hair, "Write more often." Then he climbed onto the wagon and drove out, and she watched the wagon until the road bent and took it out of sight. Caleb came and stood beside her. "He told me to take care of you," he said. "I imagined he did." "I told him you were more likely to take care of me." A beat. He said he'd noticed. She looked at him. He was looking at the road where Thomas's wagon had gone, and there was something in his profile that she had come to know over these months. The particular quality of his attention when he'd decided something mattered. He turned and looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the train station." He looked at her steadily. "About the fact that I asked you to come to Kansas, and you came, and you've been here 4 months, and it's—" He stopped, took a different approach. "I'd like to make this proper, if you're willing." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking if you want to. I'm aware of what I am, and what this place is, and that neither of them is—" "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. They were married on a Saturday in the middle of May at the Millhaven courthouse, with Frank and Louise Garfield as witnesses and Asa Pruitt, who happened to be in the building on business, as an unexpected addition to the small company. There was no ceremony beyond what the justice of the peace required, which was very little. Margaret wore her good dress, which was dark blue and practical, and Caleb wore his best coat with the sleeve Margaret had finally mended in March. Louise Garfield cried a little, which she seemed embarrassed about, and Frank shook Caleb's hand for a long time and didn't say much, which was how Frank showed things. Pruitt, to his credit, shook Margaret's hand and said, "I misjudged you when you first arrived." "Most people did," she said pleasantly. "I was wrong," he said, in the direct way of a man who didn't apologize often and meant it when he did. "You weren't the only one," she said, and let him off the hook, because there was no profit in holding things against people who'd arrived at the right place eventually. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon, and the Kansas spring was doing what it did in May. Big sky, good wind, the land showing every shade of green it had. The kind of day that made you understand why people came out here in the first place, why they stayed through the winters and the mud and the loneliness, because this was what waited on the other side of all of it. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch steps, the porch that now had a proper railing, installed sometime in February without announcement, and looked at the land, the south pasture with the shorthorns settling in. February in the near pasture, 6 months old and breathtaking in the way of young horses who have found their full stride. The new fence posts pale and solid along the eastern boundary, the barn with its roof sound, the house with its chimney drawing clean, the storage shed with a roof that no longer had opinions about which direction it wanted to face because Margaret had fixed it in January and it had stopped having opinions after that. Caleb came out and sat down beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and she took hers and they sat in the evening light and looked at the same land. "Aldrich wrote," he said. "He wants to know if we're interested in a 3rd cow next spring. He has a heifer coming up that he thinks would suit the breeding program." "Does she come from the same line as the roan?" "He says so." "Then yes," Margaret said. "We should look at her at least." He nodded. They drank their coffee. A meadowlark was doing something complicated and pleased with itself somewhere in the south pasture. "Louise told me," Caleb said after a while, "that Vera Slade came to the Ladies' Society meeting last week and said something." Margaret looked at him. "What did she say?" "She told them she'd been getting advice from you on the ranch accounts, that it had helped." He paused. Apparently she presented it to Howard as her own thinking, which is probably why he listened, but Louise said Vera told the women where it came from. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about Vera Slade in this kitchen with her cold coffee and her rehearsed apology and the list Margaret had written her. She thought about the kind of courage it takes to show up somewhere you've been unkind and ask for help anyway. "Good for her," she said, and meant it without reservation. The summer came and the work intensified the way summer work on a frontier ranch always did. Longer days, more of everything, the kind of physical effort that by evening left you too tired to think about anything beyond what needed to happen in the morning. The 2 shorthorns settled into the herd, and the roan, whom Margaret had started privately calling Mabel, which Caleb had pretended not to notice and then started using himself, was confirmed in calf by June, which was ahead of schedule and better news than they'd hoped for. Frank Garfield came over twice to help with haying, and they went over twice to help Frank with his, which was how it worked on the frontier, the neighboring families making a kind of informal economy of labor that the ranches couldn't survive without. Margaret made 2 large meals on the Mercer haying days, and Louise made 2 large meals on the Garfield ones, and the children ran around the hay wagons being underfoot while the adults worked and nobody minded. Margaret noticed during those days that Caleb was different around people than he'd been in December. Not transformed. He was still a man of few words, still more comfortable with work than with talk, but less sealed. He laughed once at something Frank said, a genuine laugh, the kind that got away from a person before they could make a decision about it. He sat at the supper table with the Garfields and didn't seem to be waiting for it to be over. She mentioned this to Louise one afternoon when the men were out of earshot. "He's always been like that," Louise said, shaking her head. "Able to be that way, I mean. He just, after whatever happened to him before, he shut it off." She looked across the pasture to where Caleb and Frank were working. Frank said last winter he seemed like a man doing penance for something. Now he just seems like a man. Margaret thought about that for a long time after. There is something that people get wrong about hard-lived women, about women who have buried husbands and managed alone and survived winters and made difficult decisions without anyone to consult. People look at those women and see what's been taken from them. They see the gray hair and the practical dress and the work-worn hands, and they calculate the losses, and they think, that is a woman who has given up the most important things. What they miss is what the surviving built. Margaret was 56 years old, and she had more of herself than she'd ever had at 30, at 40, at any of the ages when the world had looked at her and seen more value in what she looked like than in what she knew. She had spent decades earning an understanding of land, animals, weather, money, people, the real education, the kind that doesn't come from any school, that only comes from being present and paying attention and getting things wrong and paying attention to that too. She had arrived in Kansas carrying all of that, and a world that had looked at her age and her gray hair and her weathered hands and seen someone past her usefulness had been simply wrong. That was the thing she wanted to hold on to. Not as bitterness. She had learned long ago that bitterness was an expense she couldn't afford and couldn't recover from, but as a fact, as something worth knowing and worth saying plainly. The world is often wrong about which people still have something left to give. The world was wrong about her. By the end of summer, the ranch's numbers told a different story than the ones Caleb had stared at in that brown ledger for 9 years. Not a dramatic story, not a sudden transformation, but a real one, solid and earned and built from the kind of decisions that don't feel like decisions in the moment but accumulate into a life. The herd was growing in the right direction. The fencing held through summer without a single post lost. The supply costs were down because Margaret had negotiated a bulk arrangement with Pruitt that he'd accepted partly because it made business sense and partly, she suspected, because he'd been recalibrating his opinion of her since May and wanted to demonstrate it. Mabel the roan calved in late August, a strong bull calf that was going to be worth something in 2 years. And Margaret and Caleb stood at the stall fence watching him find his feet in the particular ungainly way of the newly born. And Caleb said, "That's 4 calves this season, including February's dam." "Next year should be 5 or 6 if Aldrich's heifer works out," Margaret said. "At this rate, in 3 years you'll have a real breeding operation," she said. "Not a holding pattern, an operation." He was quiet for a moment. "We," he said. She looked at him. "In 3 years we'll have a real breeding operation," he said, without emphasis, just correcting the word. She looked back at the calf. "In 3 years we'll have a real breeding operation," she said. She felt him shift beside her at the fence, a small adjustment, the kind of movement that didn't mean anything by itself and meant everything in context. And they stood there watching the calf in the clean evening light, and the meadowlark was at it again in the pasture, and the new fence posts ran straight and pale and solid along the eastern boundary as far as she could see. But the following spring, Vera Slade stopped Margaret outside Pruitt's store, not with 2 women and a lowered voice, but directly, in the open, with her chin up. "Howard replaced the south fencing," she said, "and we bought additional hay in November before the price went up." She looked at Margaret with an expression that had shed most of its armor. "We came through the winter without losses for the first time in 3 years." "I'm glad," Margaret said. "I wanted you to know." Vera paused. "I wanted you to know because I told you once that age comes with knowledge, and I dismissed that, and I was wrong." "You weren't the only one," Margaret said, which was what she said to people who had arrived somewhere late, but honestly. What she did not say, because it was not the kind of thing you said out loud, because she had always been a woman who kept her most important understanding inside where it didn't become performance, was what she had come to believe across this year, across these seasons, across the barn in the blizzard, and the mud of spring, and the summer haying, and the fall ledger that finally showed numbers going the right direction. She believed that the most dangerous lie a society tells itself is that a woman's value decreases as she ages, that the years of learning and surviving and paying attention are somehow subtracted from her rather than added, that the widow with gray hair standing at the marriage registry is a figure of diminishment rather than what she actually is, a person who has accumulated something real, who has earned her knowledge the only way knowledge is ever truly earned, by living through the thing. Margaret Holloway had been overlooked for years. She had been filed in a back drawer because the world had a system for measuring worth, and her age put her outside the system's preferences. And then a stubborn, solitary, frightened rancher in Hays, Kansas, had asked for something different. Not because he was wise about it. He had his own fear driving him, his own wounds, his own incomplete understanding of what he actually needed. But he had asked, and she had answered, and between two people with more miles behind them than ahead, and no particular interest in romantic fictions, something real had been built. Not from nothing, from everything they'd each already survived. She wrote to Thomas at the end of that second autumn. He had visited twice more by then, and the second visit he and Caleb had stayed up past 10, talking about something involving crop rotation that she had not been part of and had been glad of, and she wrote the way she had always written him, plainly. The ranch is good, better than good. Caleb has 31 head now, and the East pasture is supporting all of them through the season, which was not possible 2 years ago. Mabel has calved again. February is nearly 2 years old, and she is magnificent in the way of horses that don't know they're magnificent, which is the best kind. I am well. My hands are more of a problem than they used to be in cold weather, which is the honest accounting of a woman my age who has worked hard, and I manage it and will continue to manage it. I want to tell you something that I have been thinking about since last winter. When I agreed to come to Kansas, people thought I was accepting a lesser thing, a compromise. A woman past her prime taking what she could get. I thought some of that too, if I'm honest. I was not sure what I was worth anymore, in the practical currency of the world. I was wrong about that. And I want you to know I was wrong, not because I need you to feel good about my choices. I am at peace with my choices, but because I suspect the world will at some point ask the same question of your daughters, and I want you to have an answer ready. The years do not subtract from a woman. They add. What she knows, what she can do, what she can bear. These grow. The world simply stops looking for them. I'm exactly who I was when I arrived in Hays. I am also someone your father would recognize and someone he would not, both things at once, which is how it works. I am not finished. I had thought I might be for a while, and I was wrong. Come at Christmas if you can. Bring Clara and the children. The house is warmer than it was. She folded the letter and set it on the shelf and went back to the kitchen where Caleb was at the table with the evening's work and the lamp burning yellow and the stove doing what good stoves do. He looked up when she came in. Just looked up and looked at her in the ordinary way of a man who is glad the person he loves has come back into the room, which is not a small thing, and is, in fact, one of the larger things there is. She sat down across from him, opened the ledger. Aldrich wrote, she said. I know. I left the letter on the shelf. The heifer is ready. He wants to know if we're coming to look at her in the spring. We're going, Caleb said. Not a question. We're going, she agreed. She found her place in the ledger. He found his place in whatever he was working on. The lamp held steady. Outside, the Kansas autumn was doing what it did. Honest, cold, indifferent, asking nothing of them except that they be ready for what came next. They were ready. They had built that too.